Welcome to our talk today, Safety First, Distillery Safety. And I'm joined today by the lovely Jamie Baxter of the Craft Distilling Services to tell us a little bit about essential, important information that we should know when we're setting up our distilleries. We're going to look at some of the more obvious stuff, and we're also going to look at some of the less obvious stuff. So if you are in the process of setting up a distillery or thinking about it, then do watch this and make sure you learn everything that you can about this very important thing. So without further ado, just a quick introduction from Jamie. I'll pass over to you.
Oh, hello.
Hey. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, that came across really professionally, didn't it? I don't know why I was surprised by that. Anyway, hello, nice to talk to you. And it's obviously health and safety in a distillery is very, very important. It might not be the most glamorous of subjects, and it might not be something that people who are caught up in the excitement of building their own distillery really want to think about too much, but I can't stress enough how important it is. I've built lots of distilleries now. I think it's getting on to for 60 around the world, mainly in the UK. But and health and safety is not always the first consideration, as I've just said. But in the last, about August last year, I think I had phone calls from 3 distilleries over the course of a week or so, and they'd all had visits from the health and safety executive. And they were in various states of distress after these visits, because some of them were okay and others were effectively being told you can't continue to run like this. And I think health and safety executives are going to crack down more and more on distilleries, and it's quite right that they do so, because there are some bad practices out there at the moment. I don't want to put a downer on it. You know, it's still a very exciting industry, and it's really good fun to be involved in it. But it is something that really needs to be considered.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I think the thing is, I think a lot of people tend to look at health and safety as just like the boxes that they need to tick. But actually, there's a very real risk with distilling that needs to be considered. I know there's been some incidences in the last few years, which maybe will get people thinking a bit more about it. It's not so much about ticking boxes, it's about making sure you're not going to have those terrible issues, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not specific to distilleries as well, of course. Every manufacturing site is responsible for carrying out risk assessments on their activities and deciding what measures they need to put in place that are appropriate to reduce the chances of something going wrong. Now, you can try and design as much of that out as possible as you build a distillery, but you need to have in place ongoing procedures as well, because a lot of these interactions involve people, and people sometimes don't behave in a predictable way. Particularly at this craft, you know, the smaller end of the distilling business. A lot of it is manual operations.
Absolutely, lovely. And I think we said we were going to get started with some of the more obvious things. I know we've already mentioned things like manual lifting and hot works and bits and pieces like that. I don't know if you could just give us a brief lowdown of some of those basic starter points.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, ultimately, the directors of a distillery business are ultimately responsible for the health and safety of that business. And it's the director's responsibility to ensure that risk assessments are carried out for all the procedures that happen within the distillery, and outside the distillery, actually, in offices and yards and so on as well. So it covers a whole wide range of things. And some of these will be specific to industries like distilling industry or chemical industry, because we're working with explosive materials or potentially explosive materials, but many others are applicable to pretty much every industry out there. So things like manual lifting regulations, particularly if you're operating what's somewhat laughingly called semi-automatic bottling lines, there's a lot of repetitive movements and lifting of cases of product, for example, which can be 10 kilos or above in weight. You might be twisting as you carry one of those cases and then bending to put it on a pallet or lift it on a pallet. Well, you have to carry out risk assessments of that, because you can get back problems quite quickly. I really struggle with a bad back, but I'm old and decrepit, but you're seeing more and more younger people struggling a bit as well. So you need to put in place measures to try and reduce the chances of people hurting their back. So they need to be taught and shown how to lift a weight correctly. You need to try and design the workspace to minimize the amount of twisting that's involved when you're carrying a weight as well, and obviously the amount of bending and so on. And if you can't design those out, then you have to put in measures that reduce the chance of the problem happening, like rotating staff on that place, so they're not working in the same place all the time. You know, maybe even more frequent breaks, which is always tricky. And again, on a very small scale, very often there is only one person who's available to do that job. So these are things that a distillery business has to consider. And that method of doing it with the risk assessment and then putting in preventative measures is actually the way that you have to do all look at health and safety under all circumstances. Now, these risk assessments have to be carried out by somebody who is sufficiently experienced and qualified to do it. And you might not feel that you've got that experience yourself, but there are many, many consultants who you can bring in and ask to do assessments for you.
That's lovely. I was going that funny enough, I was going to ask, you know, whether is there like a first point of call? Is there like a group of people? Is there like a help, not like a network, but is there sort of sort of accreditations or places people can go to check out what they need to do?
To be honest, Google is the easiest way to find it. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole industry that's sprung up around to support this. And the best way to do it really is find somebody relatively local to you, because again, it won't be a one-off thing. You'll have to, every time you get new staff, you'll need to make sure that they're trained correctly. As a business, you'll need to maintain records that they have been trained and that they've understood it, and then you regularly review their training to make sure that they're still fully understandable. And you need to check that they are actually following the procedures that you put in place to minimize risks. So you as the director are responsible for all of that. You can't just blame him, an operator, and say, look, I've given him the training and it's his fault that he didn't follow it. It's your responsibility to make sure that he does follow it.
Yeah, so
he or she, I should say.
You've got this sort of consistency of maintaining the training and the operations, but also the developing. Whenever you bring in new things, you then have to consider that and feed that into it as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And you know, lots of distilleries are doing quite well at the moment and expanding after the restrictions have been lifted. They're bringing in new equipment. Well, every time you do that, then you need to revisit your risk assessments to see how that affects it. And the installation, of course, you really need to do a risk assessment before you do the installation as well, particularly things like hot work. If you ask somebody to come in to do some welding in an area where alcohol has been stored or is being stored, then you need to make sure it's safe for a welder to start sparking up, and because that's a potential source of ignition.
Yeah. I know from a previous job I had in the States, actually, I used to issue hot work permits for contractors that were doing that sort of thing. Is that the same? You would have to sort of have a permit system, or is that just, do people operate like that normally? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So if you have a tank which is used to store alcohol, for example, and it develops a little leak, and you need to put a welder inside it to fix that leak, you need to make sure that obviously there's no alcohol left in the tank. You should rinse it with water to make sure that there's nothing left. And then you issue a permit to say that it's safe for the welder now to enter that tank. He's also working in a confined space. And so as well as hot work permits, you need to think about confined space working as well, and make sure there's somebody there with him, that so if he, I don't know, becomes overcome with fumes or something, then there's somebody there to pull him out as well.
Yeah.
So you've got two aspects there which combine the hot work permits and the confined space works.
I'm right in thinking there's almost like a legal and insurance issue as well, because if you issue that permit, you're essentially taking responsibility for the fact that space is safe for that person to operate in.
Yeah, well, again,
so if anything does go wrong, that's going to come to you.
Yeah, we keep coming back to it. You know, you as the director or owner of the business are responsible for the health and safety of everybody who's working on that site. And that includes your staff, but it also includes contractors or visitors who are coming onto the site.
Yeah, okay, awesome, thank you. Moving on, I know we were keen to look at sort of some of the less obvious stuff, and you were keen particularly to talk about the DSER regulations.
Yeah, the DSER regulations, the dangerous substances and explosive atmosphere regulations.
I was going to try and say it.
Yeah, so I think they come from 2002 in this country. Obviously, it's UK legislation, but it enacts some European directives, which we still have to follow, despite the fact we've left the European Union, because the legislation has rolled over. And basically, alcohol is potentially explosive, particularly when it's in its vapor form. And a lot of gin distillers, in fact, almost all gin distillers, don't make their own alcohol, for example. They buy in the neutral spirit, and that's the starting point. And that's ethanol at 96% ABV and above. Well, I think, although please don't quote me on this, the flash point of ethanol is about 15.5 degrees centigrade. Okay. So not far off, room temperature, even in the UK. And what that means is that at that temperature or higher temperatures, then alcohol can evaporate and form a vapor, and that vapor can reach a concentration sufficient that if there is a source of ignition, a spark of some sort, it can ignite and explode. And so the flash point is very, very low of ethanol, particularly very high concentration ethanol. At lower concentrations, the flash point is still pretty low, but obviously it's a bit higher than it is. So the more water there is in there, the lower the ABV, the safer the alcohol is. But nevertheless, you still have to treat it with respect. So this has all sorts of consequences for the distiller. And it might be things like, how do you store your alcohol? So if you're storing big quantities of things like neutral spirits, in tanks or in IBCs, you might want to store them outside. Now, that has other issues involved, because you need to make sure it's not going to go walkies, so you might want to store them outside in locked cages and things like that, and improve the security of your yard. If you store it inside, you might want to vent the tanks to the outside, so any vapor goes outside, where obviously it can't build up into a high concentration. And that can be true of IBCs as well. You can attach a flexible hose to it and have the vapors piped outside if they happen to get under warmer temperatures. I know some distilleries have been, and that's one of the issues as well, is that it does tend to vary what people are asked to do from area to area around the country. And some of that is dictated by the local fire officers. Some is dictated by your own insurance companies and so on. So I know some distilleries, gin distilleries, who are asked and required, in fact, to dilute their neutral spirits as soon as it arrives. So very typically, you'd fill a gin still at roughly 50% ABV, and the neutral spirit is roughly double that. And so quite a few distilleries now, as soon as the distillery is affected, and before the delivery rather is affected, and before they move it into the distillery, they transfer half into another vessel and then add water to both those vessels. And so instead of holding at 96% ABV, they're holding it at 50% ABV, which is the strength they're going to use it at anyway. Well, that raises the flash point, and so now the material's a little bit safer.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. That's a very simple move that makes a lot of sense.
It is, yeah. And I quite like that one because it is simple and cheap.
Yeah, and it's not too much. You're going to do that anyway, so it doesn't really add too much to the cost and time of production.
Yeah, particularly if you're buying it in an IBC. If you've reached that sort of scale, then you can just put an empty IBC next to it, attach them at the bottom with a pipe, and just open the valves, and the levels will equalize. And then you top them both up with water, and there you go. This job done. It's very simple to do. Yeah,
fantastic. Are there any other tips and tricks?
Yeah, so the storage areas need to, ventilation is important. And again, when you're building your distillery, you can design a lot of these things in. So many years ago, I built the City of London distillery at the bottom of Fleet Street. Well, that's in a basement, and alcohol vapor is heavier than air. So if there had been an accidental release of alcohol vapor, there was nowhere for it to escape to. So the concentration would have continued to build up. And at the City of London distillery at the time, there were, I think, 7 apartments and 2 pubs and a restaurant, a hairdressers, a tailor's, and various other businesses directly above it. So we could theoretically have created quite a big explosion hazard in the heart of the City of London. We were a bigger threat to the City of London than ISIS have ever been. But that was because we were in a basement. Now, if we were at ground level, if you had good ventilation and open doors and things like that, then any escaped alcohol vapor would just flow out of the door like a liquid would, because it's heavier than air. But in a basement, that's not possible. So we had to put in quite an expensive ventilation system to cope with that. And we also were required to effectively build a glass box around the still area with 1 hour fire rated glass, which again was very expensive. So just the fact that we were building the distillery in a basement meant put quite a lot of extra cost onto the project as a whole. Whereas, which we wouldn't have had to do if we were above ground. So that's again, so when you're looking for a location, that's just another thing that you need to consider.
I was going to say, because I went there a few years ago, and it's very close to St Paul's Cathedral, and I remember marveling at the setup, sort of back in my early days of writing, and the glass, especially around the still, and that it was explained to me then that it was essentially a safety measure in case there was any sort of explosion. It would kind of, what's the right word, restrain? It's not the right word really, but we kind of stop it, coming out further. But yeah, you're right, there's a lot of stuff in very close proximity. So I suppose that kind of, I'm starting to think now about questions to ask you. There are so many different things to consider depending on your location, because somewhere like that you've got to think about all this stuff very close to you, whereas obviously if you're out on a farm, you don't have so much of that to consider, but you still have the safety issues.
Yeah, I mean, distilleries are great on a farm. They're great farm diversification projects, and very often a farm might have an old barn that they might site the distillery in. Well, they tend not to be. they tend to be very well ventilated just naturally. You only have to stand in them to feel the wind whistling through. So that actually removes a lot of those issues just naturally, which is great. But obviously, it's not possible to necessarily design. There is always the possibility that there might be an accidental release of alcohol vapor. So again, you have to take that into account. So it's good practice that in any of the areas or zones within the distillery where alcohol vapor could build up in concentration, that you remove anything that could cause any ignition source. So basically, that's electrics. Because every time you switch on a switch or a socket or plug something in, it could generate a little spark, and that could be the source of ignition for an explosion. And so just take out as much of the electrics as you possibly can in those areas. And those that have to be there, you should install what they call ATEX rated equipment. So ATEX rating, I think, is atmospheric explosive or something like that. That's where it comes from. And basically, it's electrics that are suitable for use in potentially explosive atmospheres. So they're boxed in a way that if it does spark internally, it's safe and hidden from any potential explosive vapor like alcohol vapor.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So, and that would include the still, for example. So all the electrics on a still should really be ATEX rated, and you should remove any potential sources. Yeah. Now that then gets really confusing when you look at products like Armagnac, which I think the Appellation Contrôlée or equivalent says that it has to be made using naked flames on the still. So we're doing our best, trying to remove any sources of ignition, and we've got naked flames in that instance playing around the bottom of a still.
Yeah, because there are people that still use naked flames.
Yeah,
And you've got electric stills, but you sort of get gas-fired stills, and yeah, there's different ways of heating, which is probably going to change how you consider your safety in the distillery.
yeah. So again, you've got to consider the location of the distillery and the building that you're going to put it on, the ventilation and so on, and where you're going to store the alcohol. And then you need to consider very carefully the still that you're going to buy. We're at Craft Distilling Services, my little business now. We're in the fortunate position that we've never got involved in projects using naked flame, for example, because you can buy some quite cheap stills and heat them on paella burners and things like that, and it works nicely, but it's not the safest thing to do. And so we refuse to get involved in that sort of project, if I'm honest.
Yeah, fair enough. I should imagine naked flame causes a bit. Maybe, well, I suppose it depends where the fuel, but I would think there'd be issues with consistency of temperature as well with that sort of thing. Would there be?
Well, with naked flames, you mean? Yeah, there can be. I mean, so if you've got a gas burner, then that can be pretty consistent. But I remember once going to see a still, which basically had a firebox underneath, and just every 20 minutes they threw another log on underneath the still. And so that did. Then there was quite a rapid increase in heat and temperature, and the flow rate increased. And then it slowly decreased again until they threw another log on. That one caught fire within 6 months of installation.
Oh no! I should have been watching this video.
It's still working.
I'm just wondering if there's any other subjects if we should touch on that come to mind. Anything else?
There's the obvious things that, like forklift truck training, that we haven't talked about, and the one actually that many people from outside the industry don't think about is dust explosions, and that would be more applicable for people who are making whiskey, for example, and milling their own grains on site. You need to put in measures to control the amount of dust that is in the atmosphere, because if you get too much fine particles in the atmosphere, actually just through static electricity, it can generate a spark and can explode without any alcohol vapor or anything like that, just the dust itself. And I've seen the results of a dust explosion when I used to work in a jelly baby factory many years ago. It's incredible, the devastation that was caused by it. And it's something. Dust explosion. Yeah, I never want to see it again. It's horrible.
Oh my goodness. Well, if I've learned anything today, is that there's a lot of stuff that's quite explosive out there. You need to be quite careful.
Yeah, and I don't want to put a downer on it, of course, and it's not the most glamorous subject, but it is important. And as you said right at the beginning, there have been a few incidents, and there have been some nasty accidents, and people have been hurt.
Yeah.
So it is very important. And then to put a slightly more prosaic aspect to that, if something does go wrong, the first thing that the health and safety executive will look at are your risk assessments. And if you haven't had these carried out, and if you haven't kept them up to date, there's a good chance that you, as a director of the business, will be prosecuted. You could have a hefty fine. You can even end up in jail. So it's it is an important subject for all sorts of reasons. But obviously, it's the safety of people that's the most important.
Absolutely, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, lovely. Okay, well, thank you so much for taking some time to speak to us today. I hope that's been helpful for everybody watching. And we will be on, I still need to speak to you about this, Jamie. We need to organise a date and time, if it works, to get you on to answer a few live questions, but we can chat about that afterwards.
Yeah, okay.
So thank you very much, everybody. Okay.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much.